Well, I'm interested in finding out how much of an Amos you are. And I have to tell you a story. Excuse me. One time there was a farmer that had a dog, and it was a hunting dog, a bird dog. He never got to hunt the dog. He was too busy. Until one fall morning in bird season, he took the dog down the river, and he shot a duck, and the duck fell in the water, splashed the water up, and the dog jumped up and ran it on top of the water and picked the duck up and ran back in on top of the water. It was early in the morning. He thought he was seeing things. But all day long he did this act of shooting the duck, and the dog would run it on top of the water, pick up the duck, and come back in on top of the water. Now, this is a pretty smart farmer. He knew if he went home and told his folks about that, they'd put him in the booby hatch. So he didn't want to do that. So he went home. He called up his friend Amos. Says, "Amos, let's go hunting." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Fine." Next morning at 5:30, down the river went the farmer, his friend Amos, and his dog. Amos is a good shot, and the duck came over, and Amos dropped the duck right in the water. The dog jumped up and ran it on top of the water, picked the duck up, and came back in on top of the water. The farmer watched Amos, and he didn't even change expression. And all day long, the dog runs back and forth on top of the water. And finally, the farmer couldn't stand it anymore, and he said to Amos, "Amos, you notice anything unusual about that dog of mine?" He said, "I sure did. That crazy dog can't swim." Well, there's a moral to this story. And the moral to the story is this. Some of us go through life and we look at things and we don't even see them. Others of us go through life and we look at things and we see them, but we don't really observe them. And still others of us go through life, we look at things, we see them, we observe them, and we draw the wrong conclusion to our observation, right? So what I'm going to try to find out this morning is, or this week is, how much of an Amos you are. And there's a lot of Amos in all of us. But right now I want to know, have any of you ever really been able to, say, put your hand on a crystal and say, "Hey, that's a metal crystal"? Have you ever seen a metal crystal you can identify as a metal crystal? Have you ever done that?
I've seen little specks of steel, but I don't know if they were crystalline. I think they were just...
Well, now I bet you I can prove he's an Amos. Let's see. California is, relative to the state I came from, kind of new, but it's really old. And you got a lot of old buildings around, old post offices, old schools, and old churches and things like that. And they have brass doorknobs. Some of them have old brass doorknobs. And if you are not an Amos and you start looking at the doorknobs, you'll find that many times they have this beautiful design on them. It looks like an aerial photograph of a field, of fields. The delineation of little segments that are different color in this brass doorknob. Now what is happening here is these are little crystals, and these crystals are big enough, have been grown big enough so you can identify them with your eye. What happens to most of us, you see, is we play a game with nature, with things, and we don't play the same game we do with people. Like, for instance, what's your first name? Zohel. Zohel? And suppose I met you for the first time, and I was shaking hands with you. I wouldn't look off this way and say, "I'm very happy to meet you," would I? When I shake hands with someone, I look at them. When you shake hands with a doorknob, you look at the doorknob, and it'll talk to you. It says things to you like, "Hey, look at this, I'm different. Look at all these crystals in here." So I'm asking you now to be a doorknob inspector. You'll find out that you're probably an Amos. If you've never seen the crystals before, you're going to see them there. Well, I have some crystals here, and actually this is a board of pure aluminum, and if you were to look closely at this board, you'd find out that there's a spot on the board. There may be a spot on the board that's nice and bright and shiny, and if I tilt the board, that bright and shiny spot will turn dark, and a dark spot will turn out to be nice and bright and shiny, right? Okay, every one of those little areas that's different from the other area is a crystal of aluminum. But I want to tell you how I know this. I want to tell you something about the particular material so that you can talk to someone about it. And we have to learn a word, just like in tying the knot in the rope. And the word that we have to learn is isotropy. Isotropy. Actually, it means that everything, every property or every value of a property is the same in any direction in the piece of material. Let's suppose I took a sphere of glass. If I took a sphere of glass and I measured the index of refraction in every direction in that sphere of glass, it would be one value, one single value. But if I took a crystal of, say, calcite, calcium carbonate, calcite, and I measured the index of refraction in it, I'd find out as I changed direction, the index of refraction would change. And so we say, hey, it's not isotropic, it is anisotropic, or it possesses anisotropy. Well, here we get a lesson now. We're going to study metallurgy, but I'm going to tell you how you clean your pots and pans in the kitchen. If you have an aluminum pan and it's all black and dirty and you want to clean it up, a good way to do it is to use lye on it. You have to be careful with your hands, of course. But sodium hydroxide solutions will dissolve aluminum oxide. And we're going to see more of that later this week. But if we were to take a spherical crystal of aluminum, say I took a big crystal of aluminum and I carved it into a sphere, and I put it in hot sodium hydroxide and boiled it, and say after about an hour I took it out, it would no longer be a sphere, it would be a cube. And that's because the crystal faces that are the cubic faces don't dissolve as fast as all the rest of the crystalline faces. So this material is chemically anisotropic. Now, visualize, if you will, then, a plate of material. Let's say, like this board, let's suppose this is a plate of material. And where my finger is here is going to be a grain boundary or a crystal boundary. The crystal on this side is oriented differently than the crystal on that side. So the little cube faces are tilted like this on this side, and they may be tilted like that on that side. So if I put it in hot sodium hydroxide, and it'll dig out little etch pits, and those etch pits will be oriented differently on this side and that side, and all of a sudden I can find it, gee whiz, I can distinguish between, delineate between crystal A and crystal B. Okay? It's because of the chemical anisotropy in the material. Well, all metallic materials are crystalline, and I'd like to ask you this question now. Does anybody here know what this is? Oh, sure, you must. A coat hanger, right. Now, what I'm interested in finding out is if you think it's a metal coat hanger, right? So if you think it, do you think it's a metal coat hanger, just hold up your hands now, okay? And if you think it isn't a metal coat hanger, hold up your hands. And if you don't think, hold up your hands. Well, I've always got somebody like that. Well, it's not a metal coat hanger. I call it a metal coat hanger, too. That's because I'm sloppy with my language. But the fact of the matter is, this is an alloy coat hanger. And so we have to find out the difference between a metal and an alloy. And what do you think an alloy is? Mixture of metals. Almost correct. An alloy is going to be a combination of at least one metal and at least one other element. All right? The second one doesn't have to be a metal. So, for instance, this material that the coat hanger is made out of is iron and carbon. It's a piece of steel. And carbon is not a metal, doesn't get classified as a metal. And so it combines, it makes this combination that we call steel. But alloys have metallic properties. So when we talk about our definition of a metal, we said it was an element that had metallic properties. An alloy is a combination of metals and other materials that have metallic properties. So we could put together iron and carbon, make an alloy. We could put together, say, copper and oxygen, make a perfectly good alloy called tough pitch copper. And certainly oxygen is not a metal, right? So it's a combination of these particular things.
A metal is an element that has metallic properties: strength, hardness, metallic luster, ductility, and is solid at room temperature. All metallic materials are crystalline at room temperature. Isotropy occurs when every value of a property is the same in any direction in a material. Anisotropy is not independent of direction. An alloy is a combination of at least one metal and at least one other element.
We normally think that we have plenty of metals they're so plentiful for us that we don't even bother to learn what it is. Like I asked you this morning, do you know what a metal is? Everybody has metals surrounding them. You couldn't do without them. The fact of the matter is, were I a magician, if I could reach out and pluck all the metals away from that gentleman right there, he'd have holes in his teeth, his pants would fall off, and he'd be in the basement. Because the fillings in his teeth are dependent upon having metallic alloys, and the zippers and the hardware that he used to hold his pants up are generally metallic, and the beams that are underneath us are generally metallic. And so we are so used to this that we just don't pay any attention to what they are. But listen to this. Do you know that if I were really that magician and I could reach out and take all those metals away from you, that you'd never hear a bugle again? You'd never hear a piano again? You'd never hear a radio again? The world of music that we used to would just sort of disappear. And so we have then a very unusual situation in that this material, these metallic materials that are so useful to us and so beneficial to us, they appear to be so abundant to us that we sort of ignore them. We don't pay any attention to them. But what we would like to do, what I would like to do, is to talk a little bit about whether they are really that abundant or not. Now, we use certain metals more than we use other metals, but we don't pay much attention to how much of the different ones we use. In fact, we don't have any easy way to tell. So I'd like to run through that this morning with you and to show you something about the occurrence of the metal, how we deal with them, how long we've been doing this, sort of look at the history of these particular materials. So let's just first of all talk about what's the oldest profession in the world. A lot of people say it's prostitution. I think they had to have coinage first, you know. So I think perhaps metallurgy came first, but I'm not really sure. But there's something that we do know. We do know that metals have been so important to man that we name ages after them. You know, like we have the Bronze Age, we have the Iron Age. Of course, we had the Stone Age ahead of that, ahead of the Bronze Age. But we identify these particular ages with the ability of man to derive a use out of these metals and alloys that he put together. And so I think it would be interesting for a moment just to examine what early man probably did and where they came from, where these things come from. Well, number one, most metals deteriorate in the atmosphere. Now, later on we're going to study a bit about that, but what this really means is if we took most any metallic material and let it sit on the face of the earth, in time it's going to go to its lowest energy configuration and will generally be a compound.